Welcome to the Care for the Caregiver webinar series. Today, we start a two-part series called Encouraging Independence. We want families who are raising a child with a disability to start early, thinking about how they can help their child become more independent as they grow. Enjoy!
Hello, caregivers. Thank you all so much for coming today and for taking time to watch this absolutely amazing webinar, which is titled Encouraging Independence. So many of us who have children with a disability, we're not as aware of encouraging independence early. And this conversation is all about that, not waiting until our children are 15, 16, 17, 18 before we start teaching them skills and giving them the tools that they'll need to live independent lives. Today, I am honored to have two therapists who are also PhD recipients, Dr. Fishy and Dr. I don't know how to say your last name, Tony Ciea?
Saya.
Saya. Okay, Tony Saya. And they are, just revolutionary women in the disability movement, independence living movement. And we're just so honored to have both of you guys here to talk to us about this really important subject that, again, I think many parents don't really start considering until it's too late. So thank you for being here today and for speaking about this. I'll let you take it away.
Thanks so much. We are so excited to be here. As Michelle said, this is definitely a passion of ours. Just for some background, and I'll let her introduce herself as well, but Tony and I have been friends for a really long time. We both identify as disabled women, and we're both really passionate about the independent living movement and its principles and how to really help disabled individuals be independent and live their lives the way they see fit to live them and be involved in making those decisions. So we're going to split this up into two webinars because there are a few independent living principles and they're all important. And we want to just give each one the time it deserves. But we're really excited to talk to you about it today. And we'll throw in some personal examples and kind of just have a conversation. We are also both open books. And so if there's any questions, concerns, comments, we welcome them all. And I'll let Tony introduce herself too.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Tony Saya. I'm so excited to be here today to discuss, the independent living principles alongside my very best friend. We are both wheelchair users, which this is kind of interesting because we have overt disabilities, right? But over Zoom, from the neck up, you can't really tell. So first, order of business is never assume, right? Because I think that's just really important. But I think it also is just really important to realize that, we're disabled women guiding the conversation, which is already something that historically doesn't happen, right? We often have professionals telling us about our experiences, but really this is really a conversation to really bring the lived experience to the forefront. And really consistent with the phrase, nothing about us without us, right? So we need to be involved. And I just, one really quick thing is that sometimes when we talk about independence, we think about this like magic age, like it happens at 16, 17, 18. But here's the thing, it starts from the minute that they're born. Independence should be something that we think about very early. But for some reason, especially when we are talking about disability, we tend to put this off. And so I hope in this discussion that we really can bring the lived experience, and I'm sure you'll figure out why we're best friends throughout the presentation. We often finish each other's sentences. So that always goes well for talks, but yes, please engage. And if you have any questions, we really want this to be usable to you. We don't really believe in just a lecture style. This is a learning together. But I also want to say that this is the start of a conversation, right? This is the beginning, and this is not a fact sheet. This is looking at ways you could think about these concepts in your own life and while you're caring for your child. So I think you could go ahead, Gab.
Awesome. Let's do it.
Yeah, so real quick while she's doing this, one thing I think that's really important to think about before we even engage in the topic is that we have to come into the conversation with an open mind to examine what we think we know about disability. A great activist, Stella Young, once said, we should examine what we think we know about disability because we've been sold a lot of lies about disability. And so I hope you could come into this conversation with an open mind. Go ahead, Gab.
Awesome. So first order of business, I think, is to introduce what the independent living movement is, especially if your child is on the younger side. This isn't something that comes along with introducing disability, even though I think I can speak for both of us and say that we think it should be. And so we just wanted to give a little bit of background as to what we mean when we say the independent living movement. So this is really a philosophy. It's a movement for people with disabilities by people with disabilities to really push the fact that we deserve the same degree of freedom, of choice, of self determination, and rights as every other person. And it really focuses on what equality for the disability community looks like and putting disabled individuals at the forefront. And I realize I probably should have started with this, but just as a disclaimer, we will be saying disabled a lot. And so before I give a lot of these talks, I just like to explain. I know a lot of us are used to really trying to use person first language. Tony and I, as disabled women, have made the choice to use identity first language because being disabled is something we consider a really important part of our identity and a really big part of who we are. So that's really a disability pride thing. And so when I say disabled person or disabled woman, I'm not doing it in a derogatory way. I'm doing it in a this is who we are. So I think
Yeah,
that's just important because we'll do that a lot.
yeah, it's a sense of reclaiming. And again, this is kind of, again, one of the lies that you've been sold. You've been sold that there's one type of language in terms of disability, and language is a continuum. Disabled people are going to prefer different things and use different language. And we will probably code switch back and forth, but when we're definitely speaking about ourselves, right, we're going to be using identity first language. But it's important to know that, right, this is one snapshot. Um,
Yep. And this last point here, I think, is really important. It's kind of the crux of the movement itself, and it's that the disabled people are the experts, right? And just as Tony said in her intro, like we should be the ones having these conversations, not just about the disability community, but about our lives. We should be actively put in the driver's seat, and the more we can encourage independence from the beginning, the easier that's going to be.
Yeah, and I just want to say, I always say I didn't come out of the womb with no disability rights, disability culture book. My parents didn't get it either, right? And so this is something that they had to learn, right? Gabby and I had to go to college
Yeah.
to kind of find this. And so something that we wish is that we knew some of this earlier. And so that's why we're bringing it to you now. So if you're thinking to yourself, like, how does this relate? Even if it doesn't relate right now, it will relate at some point.
And also, I think that's a really important point too, Tom. Like, it's okay if you don't know yet. Like, that's why you're here. And it took our parents have very I mean, like we did this for a living, right? And we really found it when we came to college and we were reclaiming our identities, and like it took our parents a long time, and we were in the crux of it, and we have conversations still to this day. So it's okay if you don't have all the answers. That's not expected. It's just we're here to learn and grow.
Okay, you could go ahead.
This is Ed Roberts, and I think when introducing independent living to anybody, he deserves to be on the screen and he deserves to be talked about. This is the father of independent living, as he's known, and he opened the first Center for Independent Living in 1972. Um, Ed, he has polio, and he wanted to go to college and he wanted to do all those things, and him and his mother really advocated. I mean, I could talk about Ed Roberts and what he did for a really long time, but the summary is that they advocated for him his whole life, and he took that into college at Berkeley, and at first was denied even a spot to go because they couldn't accommodate his needs, and he didn't take that for an answer. And that grew into what became the first Center for Independent Living. And these quotes kind of just illustrate his view of like the greatest lesson of the civil rights movement is that it's a movement that you don't let others speak. When you let others speak for you, you lose. Then he also said, I realize that disability is actually a strength and can be very powerful. So
And I
again,
just,
that speaks to
oh,
that
sorry.
sort of reclaiming of the experience. No, you're good. Go ahead.
Sorry, Gab, on Zoom, it's very hard to know when you're stopping. So I just want to say, I think that he's one of the first people that really changed the way we view independence. So a lot of times when we think of independence, we think of doing it alone, right? Doing it on your own, right? But this is really about doing it in a way that you're in control of it. So not necessarily meaning that you're doing it on your own, right? But you're in control of what is being done for you. So an example I like to give is I'm someone that I don't like to wash my own hair. It takes a lot of my own time, and I value my time. And so I go and get my hair done frequently so that I don't have to wash it, right? But when I sit in that chair, right, I'm in control of what's the style, how is it going to be done. I'm not just throwing my hands up in the air and say, do whatever you want, right? And some people might think of that as dependence, but that's actually independence, right? I'm making the choice to go get my hair done because I value my time and I'm in control of it. And all of us could think of times when you go to get a haircut, right? You don't just say do whatever you want, right? You go with a style that you want, you're prepared. And so I just think it's really important because sometimes we over focus with disability on this, they must do it alone. They must do it alone. But here's the thing, non-disabled people don't do things alone. All of you can probably think of having children and think of this phrase, it takes a village. And it's totally okay to get help from different people. But sometimes with disability, that same sentiment is all of a sudden not okay. Right. So it's really about, in this case, when we're talking about independence, it's about the control that the disabled person is in control of what is being done. They're not just being cared for, but they're in control of the care. So I think that that's a really important distinction because when you're talk to doctors and in the medical world, right, they focus on independence as one person doing one thing. Go ahead, Gab.
So just so we can kind of get an overview, and we're going to focus on some of these specifically today, but these are the core principles of the independent living movement. So you have dignity at risk, you have consumer control, informed choice, community integration, and advocacy. And they kind of make up what the movement focuses on. And we are going to dive deeper into two of them today, one of them being my favorites. So we'll get into that. And
Yeah,
then
so on the screen, the two that are in brown, right? The two
yep,
arrows that are in brown are what we're going to focus on today, right? Which is dignity of risk and informed choice. And
and we
then let's
hope that you
come
guys
back.
come back and listen to us talk about the other ones too, because they're all really important. But so we'll just jump right in. So
So
first,
I'm going to do this one because you're going to do the other one.
go ahead.
Okay. So informed choice, right? Having information about all options and the right to make decisions impacting their life. So I think the key point is all options. Sometimes we think informed choice means giving information just about one option because that's the option that we want, right? But think a little bit, and I'm going to really boil this down. Think about when you go to a restaurant and you have a menu, right? You have all these options, right? There's I can think of maybe one time where there's one item on the menu, right? It's like that wouldn't be a menu, right? And so options, right? They're giving you the details, they're telling you what you're going to expect, right? And this is the same kind of thing we want to bring in to our children's lives, right? This idea to make decisions, and it's not just about the the major decisions, right? The major choices. This could be something as simple as what to wear in the morning, what to eat at a restaurant. This could be, involved in, in supports like therapy, right? But it's not just selling one option. And I think that that's really important. It's really giving options and having them make the decision based on what they know about the option. So even if you give two options, but you're like, so do you want A, where you have this, 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 and this, and then you go, and B is this, right? That's not an equal experience, right? That's not really giving, you're clearly leading them to choose A because you're packaging it differently. So I think it's really important that we want to give um, the all the options. What are the what are the risks, what are the the important pieces of each choice, and this is really important. And I bet some of you are like, well, but I don't know, can my kid really engage in informed choice? Like, they're young. I mean, they don't even understand all the options. If you don't start now at providing options, we promote this idea of learned helplessness, and then they decide that, well, they don't have to make choices because their parents are making them for them. So then when they do reach adulthood or, teenage years, they're unable to make choices, whether it's simple or complex. And not only that, about making the choice, but they don't know how to gather the information to make an informed choice. I want to be real clear that this is not about deciding what is the right choice, right? This is about having options to make a decision based on the information available. Go ahead, Gab. I know you're ready to go.
No, you summed that up really well. Not that I had any doubts. Um, the I think the other thing to add, like she said, it's not necessarily about making the right choice, and I think that can be particularly hard for parents because presenting all the options means presenting all of them, not just the good ones. And I think
The perfect.
one of the examples of this, right, is when my mom, she dropped me off at college, right, and it was, I mean, the long and short of that is that I'm from Philadelphia, and I knew from a very young age that when I moved away for college, it was going to be to somewhere warm. So that meant that you had to get on a plane to get there. And so we fly to Florida, where I spent my first 2 years. And my mother, she was really good at encouraging independence. I'll give her that. But even she, when I was going to move away from her and she wasn't going to be able to make sure I was okay, she was like, why don't I get you like a personal care attendant? And they can like help make sure your room is clean and help make sure you're doing your laundry and help you with food and all these things. And I was like, but I just spent the last however many years learning how to do all that. So I'm gonna go do it. And she was like, I don't know about this. And so one choice became I could just go and let her do it, and she may or may not fall on her face, or I could set up a PCA, right? And she did to her. My mother perseveres. She sent a couple to my door, and I was like, sorry, we're good. Don't need
I
you.
just want to be clear, though, for the record of this example, if you want a personal care attendant, there's nothing wrong with that,
Of course
as
not.
long as that you're in control of the personal care, right? So that,
Right.
like, there's plenty of options, like, where I'm like, you know what, I got to bring somebody to help me and support me in this way. I
Yeah.
want to be real clear that there's nothing wrong with that. It's about the option
No.
to choose whether you want one or not.
18-year-old me was like, I worked real hard for this and I got this. I have learned now that like I'll take help with some things, no problem. But 18-year-old stubborn me was like, I got it. And that was my choice. Now, like, was my room always clean? No. Was my laundry always done? No. But like I was
But that's
okay.
true for non-disabled
Yep.
non-disabled people. My
Yep.
siblings are non-disabled. Their rooms didn't look clean. So again,
No.
I think that we have these other, like, these strange ideals of like what normalcy, and I'm going to put that in air quotes because again, I challenge whatever we're deeming as normalcy. But for some reason, we put these very we're so concerned about certain things for disabled children that we would never even think about
No.
non-disabled children. Nobody's asking my mother if my brother cleaned his room, but it would be like, how's she surviving in college, right? So I think that that's really important to think about, and I think it's also about not just. I think sometimes we get this thing that like mothers or fathers, they know best, right? And it's kind of your job to kind of guide us. And while we need that guidance because we can't immediately do everything on our own, right? I think it's really important to think about how these choices impact your children. And if you're only ever giving one side, that could be very problematic. I'll tell you one thing, the real truth though. If my mom gave me a lot of informed choice about therapies, I probably wouldn't have been attending many because I was so over therapized. I mean, everything was therapy. It was occupational therapy, physical therapy, horse therapy, play therapy, this therapy. And there was limited time for me to be a kid. So I think listen to your children. If they look like they're over it, they're over it. Don't assume that, well, maybe they don't know if they like it. If they look over it, they're over it. And produce, give options and the right. And some of this, right, is going to make more sense as they're making more choices, right? But I think it's really important that we don't gear the choices based on our expectations, because we know that the research shows that there are lower expectations for disabled children. We know that society places on us. So it's important that when we're giving choices that we're not biased in our choices. Like, for example, like, Tony, are you sure you don't want to go to community college? Right? Like, that's the way that's framed is bias.
I will say you don't want to go to college somewhere you don't need an airplane?
Yeah, for me, I will say that my experience is a bit different because I'm the baby. So I'm one of four. And so when I was born, my parents were kind of tired, I like to say, and they just let me do whatever my siblings were doing. Whereas Gabby is the firstborn. So kind of she laid the groundwork. So it's kind of a different experience in that sense.
Guys, my screen just changed. Can you still see it?
Yeah. You're just not in slideshow anymore.
Oh, which is weird because I didn't touch anything. Okay. There we go.
I think you could go ahead.
Okay, so what does this look like for you guys? These are just some general examples. We gave a few, but are they informed? I put this bullet as the first one for a reason. We could probably spend a whole webinar on this, so we won't right now. But do they know about their disability? Are they aware?
This is really important.
This is very, very important. I have worked, and so Tony's seen me. I have worked with a lot of parents who are like, but they can pass, so if I don't tell them, it's okay. Especially if you don't have, like Tony described our disabilities as overt disabilities, right? If you don't have an overt disability, I've worked with a lot of parents who are like, well, they don't have to know because then they'll know they're different or whatever. Unintentionally, that's sending a negative message of if you have a disability, something is wrong with it. So it's important from an early age to know what part it plays. And I'm saying this from experience. I'm not even saying my parents did that all right. Right? Like, but from experience, I wish as a disabled person that I had embraced my identity sooner, earlier in my life. So I think it's really important to be informed in that way.
I don't even know if it's just about the embracing identity, because like a 5-year-old, embracing identity is very difficult. But I think it's about embracing the experience. And I want to be clear that this does not mean that every day of our life is sunshine and daisies, and that we're not frustrated about our experiences. Because guess what? Our life is tough, but it's not tough for the reasons that you think it is. It's not tough because I'm sitting here like praying and hoping that I could like jump or skip. It's tough because of the attitudinal barriers and the low expectations that people place on people like me and my community, right? It's not, and again, this is kind of tied to this idea that we've been sold the idea that disability is capital B and capital T, bad thing, right? And so when we constantly say, well, I don't want to tell them that they're different, that sends them the message that they're not okay as is. And here's the thing, you're not hiding it well. Here, I promise you, your kid will figure out that they have a disability. And it's either that you want them to figure it out when you're home and you're supportive of them, or that they're just like, man, this was hidden from me my whole life. And they're gonna have to figure out on the fly how to deal with that.
Yeah,
Right?
it's a
And I think that that's
interesting
really,
experience.
really important. I think one thing I like to share and is that again, I grew up right, and I didn't realize at the time I didn't have the language, but my parents were manipulating the environment so that I could participate at a very young age. So I didn't realize, right? I had no idea, right? And it's not, I mean, I knew that I was going to therapies and I knew I was going all these things, but I didn't really put it together. And I distinctly remember coming home from kindergarten saying, Mom, did you know that we could park in the handicap spot? Yes, at that time I had poor language because I didn't know that the real term for that is accessible parking. But I'm giving you the real time story, which is, and when I said that to my mom, she looked at me like stunned, as if she's like, what do you mean you didn't know? Like, not even about the parking, but it hit her at that moment that, like, I'm just walking around. I had no idea. And like, and the other thing is like all I cared about is that we could go to the mall and like park close, right? So it wasn't as like negative as she thought. I think embracing disability is also about not ignoring it.
Yep.
Sometimes we like to ignore it, right? Or like we like to be like, oh, like we're not going to let our disabled children hang out with any other disabled children because then they're more disabled. No, people like to hang out in their community, so embrace that. Like,
There's a reason, like there just from our experience, right? There's a reason that I don't even say this lightly. Like my life completely changed when I met Tony. Like 180. And we didn't get to meet until we were in college, but I was like, wow, this person like understands me. And we say all the time, like I can talk to her completely freely about anything, and that's because I found someone who's in my community who gets my
yeah.
experience.
And the thing is that we could have found each other earlier, but there was
Yeah,
this idea that, you know, well, if we bring her in community, then we're admitting that she's disabled, like it's so bad. Right. And if you think about other areas of your life, we all hang out with like minded people, whether it's
yep,
colleagues, whether it's, if you play a sport, like, right, you're all, you're hanging out together. One thing that I always say, because people are like, well, but, there are some frustrations with disability. Yes, there are. It is
absolutely.
very frustrating after I go get a pedicure and I stub my toe and it's ruined 5 seconds after yes. And you know the person I call? I call Gabby. Not because
She
I
does.
can't call my mother, but because she doesn't have context for that. I mean, yes, she could yes me on the phone. Yeah, Tony, it's frustrating, but she doesn't get it. So give your child opportunities to interact with people that get it. Even if you think that they're just sitting in community, like, are they actually getting something from this? That's not for you to decide. Like, normalize hanging out with other disabled people. This
Yes.
doesn't mean that they only have to hang out with disabled people, right? I'm not asking you to go to that continuum. I'm asking you to find a sweet spot.
And
Are they given active role in making choices concerning them? Again, this is kind of different for a 4-year-old, but a 10-year-old should be very engaged in making choices, whether it's what they want to wear, what
yeah,
what activities they want to do after school. A kid doesn't have to be in dance because that's the image that you had in your mind before you had a child, right? Like, well, I thought my child was going to play, do dance. It's like, well, if she wants to do dance or he wants to do dance, that's fine, but it's not. It shouldn't be projected on them. But we
and
should
I think
also assume that they can still do dance. I think we get a lot of
yeah,
messages of like,
took the
well, my
words
kid
right out of
can't
my
do
mouth.
that.
That's what I was gonna say. You took the words right out of my mouth. But I think it's important to know that like just because it doesn't look a certain way doesn't mean it can't be. And are they given that active role in terms of like they're used to people helping them, especially with disability, right? From a young age, you're surrounded by a team, right? And so it goes back to that learned helplessness of if we don't give them that active role, they're used to being like, oh, well, mom's going to figure this out, or my parent's going to figure this out, or my whoever else is going to figure this
Sister.
out, my therapist, and the sooner they can have that active role, the sooner that dependence of somebody else figuring out the problem, which we'll get to in dignity at risk a little bit more,
Mhm.
is sort of mitigated, which is important.
I also just want to say too, even if you perceive that you could do it faster, better, quicker, neater, you have to let your child participate. You have to. Because when you're not around for whatever reason, they're going to have to be able to do it. They can't be looking around. And I bet some of you are thinking, well, I'll make sure that there's somebody around. But there's not always going to be somebody around. I promise you, there'll be times. And I think it's really important. There were some things that I didn't really learn until much later because my parents did them, right? And we have to give space for so one thing that we always talk about is that Gab, it takes Gab a little bit longer to put on her shoes. And as her friend, we have similar disabilities, but we have different experiences. And so when we were first around each other, I was like, okay, let me just do this. Like I could do it quick because I was like, well, we're in community, like I could do this. And then I realized, like a light bulb went off. I was like, well, what's Gab gonna do when I'm not here? And for 7 years, she didn't have to think about that. But
Yep.
here we are, and and it's very
She
easy.
left me, by the way.
It's very easy to get back into this idea of like, well, it's easier for them to do it, so I won't try, right? And so it's really important to let your child put on their shoes, to let them braid their hair, even if you know it's going to be messier or it's not going to, at least let them be part of the process, right?
Yep.
Let them be part of the process. But also being mindful of what you're forcing, like you also have to recognize struggle. If it's not going to happen, no matter how long you make them sit with, laces to tie, if they can't do it, they can't do it. So kind of recognizing that there are multiple ways to do things and giving space for your child to figure out what works. I remember my therapist was like so focused. She was so focused on me tying a shoe. Like she was so focused. Newsflash, lady, many years later, there's hardly any shoes with ties. But instead, like, I wish she would have given me more skills on, like, actual things that were going to benefit me. But we were so focused on the lived, like, well, other kids are tying our shoes, so it's less important. But guess what? There's Velcro and there's flats and there's other things. So
I
thinking
haven't
about
tied
that.
a shoe in like 15
Neither
years.
have I. Neither
So,
have I.
and somehow we get dressed every day, and we're not
Yep.
barefoot. So,
Get dressed every day. Okay, go to the next. Okay, here you go, Gab. Here's your.
this is my favorite independent living principle. Dignity at risk is the right to take a chance, to make a decision, and to make a mistake, just like everybody else. And I think that's the key to this principle, and it goes back to a lot of the examples we just gave. Failure is okay. It's okay.
We don't need to be
try
in bubble
something.
wrap because we're disabled. Like we
Yep.
don't need to be bubble wrapped, please.
No.
We're gonna learn it whether and some of you are probably like, well, she's never gonna know. She's X.
Oh, you muted
Sorry.
yourself. There
Yeah, you might be thinking she doesn't have the ability to know. She's not gonna recognize. She is. They are. We know. You don't need to bubble wrap us. Even if you know that we're not going to like, the fillet of fish on the McDonald's menu, if that's what we say we want, go for it once. It's not going to be the end of the world, right? And like, yes, that's a very simple example, but it's really important. We have to let those things happen. We have to sometimes, get the coat that's really difficult to put on. And even though your mom's saying, hey, if you just got one that like zipped up, this would be easier. No, we have to let that
But
happen.
that coat looks really cool, and I want that one.
You want that?
Because and it's happened, it's happened a lot. And I think the other thing about this, and my whole dissertation was on this. So if any of you like us are like research nerds and when we want the data and we want the proof, there's a
We
whole
got it.
webinar on that too. But failure is it's a part of life, and I think when we get a disability diagnosis, suddenly it's like, well, they've had enough and I've heard it verbatim. They've had enough disappointment, they have enough hard things, like I can just make these things easier, I can just do it. But you're taking away their dignity even if it's not on purpose, because they have
Taking
the
away
right
their
to
chance.
try, and then they have the right to fail, and then they have the right to try again. But
And something parents always tell me, right when they meet me, right? They're like, "Well, what is my child going to do when I'm not here?" Right?
every
That's
time.
always like, what and then the other first thing, actually the first thing is, are they going to get married? Which is like, I don't know, are we asking non-disabled people their marital status like at 5? I'm not sure. Maybe we are, probably not. So my thing is though, there's so many people focused on that. I think that that's a real concern. I'm not here to trivialize it, but it's like if you're not setting up in your everyday life a form of interdependence or depend like independence, how? I mean, like think about the same way you think about that for your non-disabled children. Like, why
Uh-huh.
is it so far away? And again, will they need some support? Sure, but other people need support too.
Yeah.
Nobody mingles in this world just doing every single thing alone, right?
No.
And that support might be that they need a personal care attendant. That support may be that they live with a family, or but that's totally cool. My non-disabled brother lives with my family. It's totally fine, not a problem. But if Tony was living there, I'd be like, she's living there because she's disabled. Why is she living there? And that is annoying, right?
Also, he
Normalize,
was given the choice to live there. It's his
right?
choice.
Yeah, it's his choice, right? So thinking about that, right? And I know the future feels like glaring, and some of you are like probably thinking, wow, you're so far, like, how do I get my kid to even move a little bit? Start practicing choices. Start asking them, do you want cereal or eggs? Obviously, don't ask choices that you can't deliver, because that's going to add to frustration. Like if you don't have eggs, don't ask, do you want to have eggs, right? But asking throughout the day, how could I best support you, or do you need anything, right? Building that into the process instead of the child feeling like they have to reach out, or that you're like over them trying to figure out what they need, right? Like let it happen a bit.
And I think, like, one thing I always say to illustrate this, I have a non disabled twin sister. Okay. So we came out on the same day, we're the same age. She, I can't even say non disabled, but she does not have a physical overt disability. And she can physically do a lot of things all on her own, right? And so I say all the time, like, she kind of became my parents and I didn't know it at the time, but like cheat sheet, because they couldn't look at her and say, okay, Stephanie's gonna go do this, this, and this, and then look at me and be like, but Gabby's not gonna do that, right? And so it became this like sort of way from an earlier age for them to be like, all right, then we gotta let her like try to figure these things out. Because I looked right at them and I was like, well, why does she get to do it? I want to do it. And so I think that just illustrates like we can sometimes let disability dictate what a life is supposed to look like, and it it doesn't have to. It can be a great part of what that is, but it doesn't have to mean they can't make these choices and take these risks for themselves. You think anybody thought it was a good idea when Tony and I wanted to jump out of a plane?
Nope,
Probably not.
they didn't,
But we were
right?
like, we want to. That
Yeah.
sounds like fun. And
I
that
also
was
think
our
though,
risk to take.
I also think that it's okay if a disabled person also doesn't want to do something too. Like,
Yes.
because we know that, we know the energy we have. And sometimes we have this over focus, like, well, if Elizabeth is doing it, then Mary must be doing it. And you have to allow for some, differences, and it doesn't always mean that we're doing it the same way, right?
It's
And
gonna
that's
look different.
okay. So don't try to like fit, a square peg into a round hole.
I
right?
think
Like
my
it's
favorite example of this, and I was just telling Michelle this the other day, this is a true story that actually happened. In the physical disability community, we get very fixated on walking and like what walking looks like because that's like what it looks like. That's what's typical. And when I found my wheelchair, right, it opened up like so much freedom for me and so much more independence because I could do things on my own that I couldn't do before. I now go, I embarrassed my mother just like 2 weeks ago. I was home for a wedding and on the same venue as the wedding, there happened to be like a disability soccer game. And I'm watching this kid, he couldn't have been older than like 12. And he's going across the parking lot in his walker, and it's an hour later, and the kid's still walking. And I'm like, and I went up to him and I was like, I was in my scooter, and I was like, you should get yourself one of these, it'll change your life. Like, and my mom was like, oh my God, but they want him to walk. And I'm like, no, like, he wants to get from point A to point B, and if it doesn't look a certain way, that's okay. Like, and so I think kind of like going off what you're saying, it's this idea of it doesn't have to look exactly the same or be exactly the same, and we can, be part of making those choices. I didn't know I had that choice till I was older, but I'm
Mhm.
really glad I figured it out.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Go ahead.
are you promoting autonomy? This is kind of like the crux of this principle. And we've given a lot of examples, but it's really important that your kids have the opportunity to make their own choices and for them not to always turn out the way they hoped it would. That's okay because that's a part of life. Um, us, I think sometimes that failure when you're disabled kind of gets like magnified a little bit. It's like, oh no, like a disabled person tried something and didn't succeed, and that's so sad.
That's okay.
But it's okay.
Everybody has to, try, right? And
And you know
I think
what? When
go
it
ahead.
when it pays off, when you've been trying real hard, like that feels really awesome too.
And you have to hold back, even if you know
Yep.
it's not gonna work out. Of course,
Yeah.
I'm not asking you to put your child in harm's way, but within reason, you know,
Yeah.
like you would do for any child.
Uh-huh. And like they get to be responsible for that outcome, good or bad. It's like when you like I remember my high school IEP meeting, and I was a senior at this point, and I hated these meetings because it's like a bunch of adults talking about you, and I haven't found like my advocacy voice yet, really. And I figured out in that meeting that I found it at least a little bit because they were like, well, she should go to a work program. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar, those are like sheltered workshop employment type, like pay disabled people $2 an hour kind of programs.
Sub minimum wage.
Yep, sub minimum wage. That's a whole other problem. But I was like, wait a minute, I want to go to college. And the whole table was like, huh? And the principal actually said, and I will never forget it. She actually said, you can do that, but we're not gonna help you because we already know it's not gonna go well. So like we're not gonna attach ourselves to that decision. You can do it. You can try, but we're not gonna be the ones that have to say like, I told you so. And
We told
here's the
them so.
thing. It worked out really well for me. I kept going to school because I liked it so much.
But I think in that example, it's not that we're saying that college is for everybody or a work
No.
program isn't for everybody, right? But it's about that oftentimes we're given one option,
Yes.
right? So I want to be clear, right? So college isn't for everybody, but that's true for non-disabled people too. Some people don't want to go
Yep.
to college. Some people do. Some people don't want to. Some people want to get a job right after high school, whatever, right? And so I think that that's fine, but I think we're often um, sold a lie that we have one option. I mean, one thing that I always kind of, and I obviously don't remember it because I was right out of the womb, but my parents tell me all the time that one doctor told my parents that a shell, pretty on the outside, but nothing else is going on in the inside. And again, that's the message that they got right out the gate.
Yeah.
right? No other counter narrative. Nobody telling them that, I may have to do things differently, but I'll still have a quality of life, right? And so I am very fortunate that my dad decided that we're just not going to go to that doctor anymore. He got kicked out of that doctor um, office because he was like, I don't, that's not accurate. Um, but but still, like, many people will be sold this information based on what we think about disability. So,
And for those of
Gab,
you
I want to make
watching,
sure we have time for questions. So just make sure
yeah,
that we're picking it up.
for those of you watching and listening to her story and saying like, wow, that's like, who could possibly say that? Mine is very similar. Okay,
Mhm.
so it happens, and that's the narrative we're putting out there, and I agree. Like, college, no, isn't for everybody. But the point of that example is, I wasn't even. If it was up to them, I wouldn't have even been given the choice, right? So we need to be mindful of the options that people have.
Even when I wanted to drive, the counselor
Yep,
was like, well, you don't need to drive. You're with your mom.
yep,
I was like, I don't want to be with my mom all day. Like, my
yep.
siblings
No
aren't with my
thanks.
mom. Like, and I'll be honest with you, if my mom is watching on Facebook, my mom is my best friend. But not because I'm disabled, because she's just a great kick-ass mom. Not because, well, can't have any other friends because I gotta have my mom. But don't worry, mom, you're number one if you're watching.
No, they are best friends. It's great. But the I think, and this like kind of sums up everything we've been saying, but I think the most important thing on here is that yes, failure is a part of life and it's okay, but it's also like, and I don't know where exactly the narrative shifts when you're a disabled person, but for the non-disabled population, we're very like, if at first you don't succeed, try again. And then for the disability population, it's like, well,
If it's not even like don't even try. It's kind of like don't
it's
even
like
try. I'll
you shouldn't
shelter
even
you.
try because it might disappoint you and that could be terrible and awful. So my thing that I always tell families and I always tell people is you can't assume. You don't know until you actually try. And if it looks different, that's okay. And if it, you know, isn't exactly the way you pictured it, that's okay. But you don't know until you try.
Yeah, and we make a lot of assumptions. Like we assume if somebody's not verbal, then they're not picking something up. But that is not true.
No.
People are listening. I cannot stand when people are talking loudly to disabled people because they're assuming that there are multiple disabilities, right? Like, do not make assumptions. Do not make assumptions that somebody is nonverbal, so they're not paying attention and they can't comprehend anything, right? We have to move away from these narratives that are selling you a lie, right? They may communicate differently. They may use, and that is okay, right? Again, we have to move away from what we think is normal.
Yeah. And also just that like normal, I don't know what that is.
I definitely don't know what that
If
is.
it exists, I don't know how to explain it to you. Hello, advance.
I think
There we go. This is our last slide before questions, but this is kind of our ending note. And we've talked a lot about this, but it's just about embracing the experience. And one thing I always tell parents is, if you yourself don't embrace it, it's gonna be really hard. And I know. And Tony and I work with a lot of families, and I've made it my mission to continue working with these families and provide support. So I don't say this thinking that it's easy. And if you need help, the resources are there. I'm there. Care for the Caregivers is there. Tony's there because I just said she is. And it, like, so
yeah.
the support's there.
Yeah, and the other thing is it doesn't always have to be a difficult conversation. Like just put it into the process. So I'm going to paste a link into the chat, which is a website that has great information, but this is the link to just the literature. And there are great children's books that naturally infuse disability as part of the process, right? So it moves away from disability being a bad thing to a more neutral process, right? And so, yes, our contact information, both of our emails are on the first slide, but I'll type them in here too. But there's great books that you probably don't even realize are including disability. Please check that list out. There's also plenty of other resources. So naturally infuse it. I bet all of you can think of a time that you read your child a book. And so you could naturally infuse this. Have this in your library. I'll put out emails in the chat now.
And so we've got a few minutes left. If there's any questions, please feel free to ask them. Like I said in the beginning, we are open books. So if anybody has a question, a comment, a statement, we've heard it all. So
Does anyone on the call right now have a question for either of these two women?
it's okay.
I'm gonna say that I really appreciate everything that you guys have to say. You know, I know dignity of risk because Gabby and I talk about it a lot. But I loved learning about informed choice today. And my son is nonverbal, is an AAC user, and there's always a lot of questions about, well, you know, do you limit what's on the page? Do you make sentences for them? And it's like, no, like you give them as much as they can handle and let them make their own choice about what words they're going to use, right? And
Just
it's very powerful. I was telling Gabby the other day, my son looked at a picture and was like, the horse is galloping. I'm like, how am I like, where did you pull galloping out of? Like, how did you even know that? But if we chose to limit his vocabulary and not give him all those options, we would have never known that he was learning words like those. Like that would like blew me away.
And I think, again, I say this a lot, but I think we could do a whole another webinar on the importance of communication. It is so important for your child. That is like a perfect informed choice example. It is so important for your child to have a way to communicate. And I have heard so many parents say to me, oh, well, he wasn't really good at that device, but like, I know what he's trying to say. I get it.
or I know what he means, so we don't
Yep.
have to watch him play on the.
Yep.
Yeah. The other thing though is if you're gonna, yes, communication is very important, but the other piece of that is listening. So you don't want to provide all these tools to communicate if you're not going to pay any attention, right? Because that is very frustrating.
Yeah.
Which I think is the other side of like, you don't always know what they're gonna say, and you have to give them the time to say it and to try to express it. Like, and it's really important.
And grown-ups and non-disabled kids say the wrong thing all the time. And it's kind of like okay, but then if it's anybody disabled, it's not okay. You know,
that's like the example I give all the time of being in my IEP, and it's like, well, she can't go to college because she didn't get straight A's. Okay.
Oh my gosh.
So the disabled person has to get all A's, but like we invented A, B, C, D for a reason, and there's lots of people getting B's and C's, and if they want to go to college, they can go with that. Not that they have to, but if they want to, that's an option. But because wasn't getting straight A's, they were like, well, that might not work. It's like, no.
Well, and I also really appreciate the conversation about making sure that your children know that they have a disability and that it's okay and that it's a part of them. I think that there are a lot of parents right now who are, well, this disability doesn't define my child. And it's like, well, it might not define your child, but it is a part of who they are.
And here's the thing, that's a great sentiment, and I really appreciate it doesn't define them, but it does. It defines every choice I make. 100%. I can't go to a restaurant without calling up if it's accessible. I have to think about it before a job interview. And it's not a bad thing, but just like we think about other aspects of ourselves, like being a woman. We know what it's like to be a woman to show up in a space, right? We've all thought about it. And so the same thing.
And not only do we say that doesn't define us, we've gotten to the point where we're like, we are proud to be women in these spaces that we're not supposed to be. And so we can get there with disability too.
One last caveat, please say the word disability or disabled. Do not look for some kind of thing that sounds better. The thing is, it is what it is, and that's built on the movement. There's no like differently abled movement. There's no special needs movement. The needs of disabled people are not special. They're needs like everybody else. And everybody else, regardless of of disability or not, we all have unique abilities and needs, right? Like, that's it. It's not about, I know we're looking for the pretty, more perfect way, but that's it. We're disabled. Use the word disability or disabled. I promise you, it'll serve you better. I
So
know, I know it's very difficult.
Tony, I don't know if you're aware, but Care for the Caregiver used to be known as DAMES, which was Differently Abled Mothers Empowerment Society. And when Gabby
I know.
came on as our vice president, she was like, I think we're going to have to change this. And we did, because when you know better, you do better, right? And like you were saying, language is a continuum. And you might be at this one place, but we want to try to work you to get to another place where you're more comfortable with
Yeah,
it.
and I always hear people say, but that's what they use.
Yeah.
That's what they use. That's the word. Who's using it is
Who's
number
they?
one. Who's they? But also the second part is, all because somebody's using it doesn't mean that it's okay. If we look at other identities and groups, we could think of language that is outdated and inappropriate and
Yes.
offensive, and this is the same thing, right? Again, there's
And
no
she-
special needs movement. I mean, Google it. There's not. There's a disability rights movement, a disability justice movement, not a disability rights movement. I mean, not a special needs movement. Yeah,
And you alluded to this one in the beginning, but can we please also get rid of handicap,
yeah,
please?
right.
Yeah.
It's not. We're disabled.
It's just an outdated term.
So if you're confused, like if you're thinking, well, but what do we say, right? Right. So if any time you would say the word handicap, replace it with accessible. Accessible parking, accessible restroom. And here's another news flash: the restroom is not disabled. I hear people
Nope.
say, well, that's the disabled restroom. Nope. The restroom is accessible. And another news flash: if every parking space had extra space and was built in a way, we could just have parking. But the reason that we don't, right, we have accessible parking because of the extra space.
So we do have a question on Facebook Live. She said, my daughter is 18, has autism and learning disabilities. She's a junior in high school. She has a lot of anxiety about the future and doesn't want to talk about options after high school. I understand that it's scary for her. Do you have suggestions on what I can do to help talk to her about the future?
Yeah. Number one suggestion is, first of all, that it's totally okay that she has anxiety over the future. Everybody does. And that's, I would try to connect her with somebody that has a disability that she may want to talk to. That might be beneficial because you could explain your anxieties in a different way. I think that just giving her space to feel that how she wants to feel, but then when she is ready, that you're ready with options and not the options that just you want. Gab, anything?
I would just add to that and say again, it goes back to that informed choice, right? So, and I'm not saying you have or you haven't, but a lot of times we can even subconsciously limit those options because after school is supposed to look like this or this. So just make sure that she does know what all of her options are, because then she can start to decide which of those she's most interested in or she wants. And I would echo the sentiment of also just communicating and networking with people that are disabled, because it can be a more anxiety producing experience if you're not exactly sure how the world, once you get out there, is going to react to you. And that, I mean, like, we've all gone through that adjustment. I still go through it every day with certain things. And so just like having that person that also understands that experience on some level is really important.
Also, just be there for her, even if she doesn't want to talk about the future and maybe she wants to talk about her favorite TV show. Allow that to happen.
Thank you. Thank you, ladies, so much for your time today. I really look forward to our next session next week. This is just really enlightening. And as a parent of two kids with autism, our North Star for our children is always independence. And it has been, at a very early age, because I don't want them to have to rely on me the rest of their lives. I want them to go off and have whatever future they want to have. And I just appreciate you guys being here and starting that conversation with parents really early, because I think the more independent we can make our children, the younger, the better. The better off they're just going to be ready to tackle the world when they can leave the nest and do that. So thank you so much for this conversation. Um, this is, again, for those of you guys who are watching, this is the first part of the series. Gabby, will you tell us what the next two independent
We've
independent
got one
living
more.
pieces are?
Yeah, no, we've got one more scheduled for next week. I think we only split it into two. Yeah.
Mhm.
And so in next week's, we will cover the remaining three independent living principles and kind of go over them like we did today and give examples, answer questions, and kind of just reframe, why all of those things are important. And again, talk about starting that conversation early. And it, it does help, we promise.
The three are advocacy, community integration, and consumer control.
Oh, love it. That's fantastic. I can't wait. I can't wait to learn alongside everybody else too. So thank you, ladies. I appreciate you guys being here.
Thank you
Caregivers,
so
we
much
look
for
forward
having
to
us.
seeing you next week.
Thanks for watching. For more educational webinars like this one, go to careforthecaregivers.org.